All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Cultish, entering the kingdom of the cults. My name's Jeremiah Roberts, one of the co-hosts here. I'm joined, as always, by my good, trusty friend, Super Sleuth, and co-host as well, too, Andrew, the Super Sleuth of the show, broadcasting live from your super secret headquarters in Harriman, Utah, by the Costco, which recently opened, by the Winco, and also by other places too. What else is your super secret headquarters by?
It's by a Smith's and a Starbucks. And what's funny is, like, a few months from now,
it's by a Starbucks. That just gives it away.
My lease is ending, so you may find where I live now, but you might not know where I live 3 months from now, unless Jerry gives that away too.
Okay. Well, interesting enough, I started giving away your location. Now you're trying to find a new place. I see. We're going to have to talk about that afterwards. I'm just totally kidding. All right, so this is part two. We are talking about John Alexander Dowie with John Collins. You've been on our initial series with us last year on William Branham. It's good to have you back with us. And just real quickly, tell everyone we're discussing the book that you recently wrote. Tell everyone about the book and again where they can find it.
The book is Militant Christian Extremism, a critical examination of John Alexander Dowie. And you can find it on Amazon. You can also find it on my website, william-branham.org. And soon I'm hoping to have it out also in audiobook form, so you'll find it in Audible.
Okay. Excellent. So I really appreciate the last part, how it kind of wrapped up really talking about how, really bad theology hurts people and truly affects people, especially in regards to even medical care. And even all these years later, coming out of the cult, just this reluctance to wait until you get to the point of taking a migraine till you get a migraine before you even take a bottle of aspirin. And now that's just, go ahead with that.
I just got over COVID. I think I told you guys that before this. My wife was so mad at me. I did not even take the cough medicine, and I literally just suffered through it. And she's, John, you're out of this thing. Why don't you take the cough medicine? And it's not that I'm against it or anything like that, but it's so embedded in my being. I don't think about medicine in the same way everybody else does.
Hey everyone, if you are watching us right now on Apologia Studios YouTube channel, you need to know that Cultish would not be possible if it wasn't for this studio. So if you want to support Apologia Studios, which also makes Cultish a possibility for you to enjoy every single week here on YouTube, go to apologiastudios.com. You can become an all-access member, and you will also get a lot of great additional content, which will also help support the studio, which will allow Cultish to be a possibility as well on a weekly basis. So we thank you all for watching us, and now back to the episode. Yeah, definitely. And just real quickly, too, not just you, but there's other people as well, too, you're talking about that really experienced it on different levels. For the majority of people that you're seeing who have come out of Branham cults, and sometimes it's like, hey, it's like an AA meeting. People have like, I came from this cult, I came from that cult. The audio that we played at the beginning of our series is a guy named Eddie, who is played by Aaron Paul in the Hulu series The Path, where he says, my name is Eddie, and I was in a cult. He's in that scene in that show. He's in this small like AA focus group, and that's where he first opens up about his past. But do you see like other people like going through similar stories about even years after about having to kind of unthink and deprogram just from the sense of like medical care or other aspects? And if so, like what are some like examples off the get-go? I'm just curious about that before you jump in.
Yeah, so I'll let you guys in on a little secret. Honestly, I've mentioned this before, but I don't think I've ever really went in depth with this.
Yeah.
When I escaped, my family was at the top of this religious cult. And I did not claim any authority because of this. My grandfather was the pastor at William Branham's Branham Tabernacle, and I was just your average Joe. I'm just an average person, right? I'm not a preacher. I'm not any of this, I had no aspiration to be a preacher. But when I left, I knew that because of who I am, there would be a lot of people listening. And I knew that there would be a lot of people who needed help, because when I left this thing, it's extremely difficult to leave a cult. You are indoctrinated. In my case, I was indoctrinated from birth, a lot of people for decades. And what happens is, psychologically speaking, you form a cult identity. And
Right.
this cult identity suppresses your authentic being.
Mm-hmm.
So inside of you, you literally have two different personalities. And I actually had to go on a rescue mission to help another cult person out of a cult, and had to take a crash course on how this works. Whenever you engage a person and you're trying to help them out of a cult, if you appeal to their things that they like, things that the authentic self likes, you can watch it surface, and you can actually watch the eyes change.
Yeah.
And if you say something that brings their cult defenses up, like if you're talking about somebody who likes baseball and you're talking about baseball, you watch them light up, but then you say, well, your cult leader didn't like baseball, did he? And you can watch that cult identity suppress it. Their eyes shift. I mean, it's like a sci-fi movie, right?
Yeah.
So you have two different identities, two personalities in your head. And when you leave, one of them just died. The person who's the cult identity, you actually suffer all the stages of grief. Not only that, it's actually worse than if a family member dies, because this is inside of you. So you feel like you had a tumor removed. You feel like a family member just left.
Yeah.
There are people who go on medication. There's some people who they just go berserk crazy for a period of time while they're healing. They're trying to understand what happened to them.
Wow.
So I set up myself and another guy who's working with me in Canada. We set up a whole network, basically an underground railroad of support for people who were coming out of this thing. And we had, I want to say it was like 10, up to 10 or more support groups, individual. We had to put them in buckets, because the people who first come out, they go wildly crazy, but they're also very, like, theologically, they're very much the same as what they left. They don't understand concepts. And then after they go through a few stages, there's some people that just go freedom, and they go wild, and they're drinking and they're partying and they're having all the fun that they missed out. Basically, they're going through adolescence.
Yeah.
They might be in their 40s and they're going through adolescence. And if you put those people who just escaped with the wild crowd, then you've got this immediate conflict, because these people are saying those people are going to hell, and those people are saying, no, I've got freedom now. So you had to basically create this cascading system of support networks, and it's very intricate, and quite honestly, very grueling. I'm at the point where I was involved with all of them at one point. I'm actually only involved with one, because even myself trying to support them, it was taking a toll on my mental health.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that. And I think just one of the aspects too is that for those that are people who are listening in, and they're probably, a lot of them are going to identify with what you are saying, but there's also a lot of people who are still from the out. I feel like in many ways I'm still on the outside looking in when I hear stories like you or other people that Andrew and I have talked to. But I think it's incredibly important, especially too, Andrew, even with you being a new church planner and helping out with that there's a huge importance, especially for the Christian church, to truly understand these ex-cultists, because a lot of you get sucked into these cults, or in this case, growing up in the cult, but even people who get brought in, or the reason why you'd stay in is because of biblical illiteracy. So there needs to be a level of compassion and understanding that when someone comes out of a cult, there's people who go into churches after leaving a cult that literally they're trying not to have a panic attack.
Yes.
That's a huge aspect. I think it's so important, because again, we're having a little bit of fun going into this Fasting Historical Origins series, but again, there's just such an importance to understand all the different aspects of, how cults think, how that works, and even, for example, you're talking about the true self between the cult identity. That's something that's prominent both in the cult that you grew up in, even really famous cult stories like the Waco and the Branch Davidians. So like in the FBI transcript, if you listen to any of the audios of the negotiations between David Koresh and the FBI during the standoff, you could actually see David Koresh fluctuate between the cult leader, David Koresh, versus the regular person, Vernon Howell. who he was prior to taking on that identity of the branch Davidians at Mount Carmel. So it's very, very important. So let me just jump into the aspects of healing. I think this is a good way to kind of jump back into it. So in chapter 9, you're talking about the Chicago World's Fair. So we're talking about faith healing, but I want to get into the nitty gritty of just the craziness of this chaos that Dowie would entail. So here's one example. And Andrew, any examples that you have too, I'll let you jump in as well too. So he ends up deciding to create some chaos. Think about the Joker in The Dark Knight, where he says, introduce a little chaos, So he ends up taking on a person, the Reverend Stutbert Godfrey Mollinger, who was a famous priest physician who prayed for the sick, but while prescribing the appropriate medicine to cure illness, which honestly, I think that's the wise thing you should do, right? You need to pray, you want to pray. Like there's actually my roommate was having issues with blood clots in his legs, and his legs did not look good. I prayed for him, but I laid hands, prayed for him. Lord, if it be your will, I pray, you're the great physician, allow his legs to be healed. But I said, you need to get to a hospital now. Like I will drive you. That's a proper thing to have. But take us into this. So that wasn't good enough. So that concept, praying for the sick, ascribing the appropriate medical care, he didn't like that, but he decided to create some controversy out of that. Bring us into that.
Well, it's all part of the faith healing strategy. You guys are cult experts at this point. You know how cults work and how, to some extent, how the cult mind works from a cult leader and a cult member standpoint. Well, think of the cult leader. We'll deviate just a bit from the faith healing and just think of the cult leader himself. The cult leader is somebody who creates a problem, gets the people to believe the problem, then convinces him that he's the answer to that problem. Every cult leader known to man throughout time has done this. William Branham did this. Dowie did this. You can go all down the line. They create what they call sin. They say it's different than the other Christians. What they call sin is not including these other sins, and we know the true sins, so you can't do these things. I have the answer to know what are the true sins, so you don't go to hell, right?
Right.
So from a faith healer standpoint, well, if you take that same strategy and apply it to faith healing, he's telling people, number one, you can't go to get your medicine from a doctor because that's sin. I have the answer. You can come to me, and my answer to your health needs are not sin. It's the same strategy. What I've learned to do in my research of these con men is to take religion completely out of it. Yes, They're talking religion. Yes, they use the word Christianity, but you have to look at the underlying strategy of what they're doing. And their strategy is that of a con artist, not the strategy of a Christian man.
Oh, that's really good. Andrew, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on this so far?
Yeah, and it makes sense that it's the strategy of a con artist, just because, the Christian man, controversy for the sake of the kingdom, right? Dr. Walter Martin says it all the time, is a divine command in terms of what the gospel is and what God's word says. But the controversy of what's going on here is someone that is saying that you can't take any medicine. He said, this is Dowie in terms of this Pittsburgh controversy. He said, healing by God does not require several bottles of mysterious medicines. I mean, that's absolutely true. God can heal whoever he wants, whenever he wants, but at the same time, he is also in his sovereign power. He's made it so people could actually create things in this world that are medicines that could bless people, that can heal things. So he went from being someone who could be essentially a preacher that helps bring the gospel for healing, right? Or the right relationship between men and God. But now that's not the issue. Medicine's the issue. This is the gospel issue. And that is not controversy for the sake of the kingdom. That's controversy for his own gain, essentially.
Yeah, and there's another psychological aspect to this that I actually really hadn't thought of that until you just said what you did. One of the strategies that works with cult leaders, and this is a lot deeper study, but they're all using psychological concepts and strategies to indoctrinate people. What they're trying to achieve ultimately is mind control. If you can, the brainwashing is used very loosely I think too loosely at sometimes, because that's not really describing what they're doing. They're trying to manipulate your mind. They're trying to get you to be at comfort with what they're saying and achieve control of your mind by you willingly giving them control of your mind. And one of the strategies of doing this, you've seen it in Jim Jones and his strategies, is to just berate the people. You basically beat them down into submission, and you do it in very simple terms. You want to achieve the father scolding the child, and you want to get them in that state of mind. And you can't do that with complicated terms. Dowie could not come up with a complicated strategy explaining why medicine is evil, even though God could use it. He has to just simply cut it off at very, very simple terms.
Yeah.
When you're being manipulated to think like a 6-year-old, you're not going to think, well, God could also have produced the medicine to heal me. God could have also instructed the doctor on how to find what is wrong with me. It's so much more complicated than the 6-year-old mind could have. But psychologically speaking, they're belittling the people, and they're just berating them to they're in this state of almost a catatonic state.
Yeah. And so jumping back into the book, I mean, this is just, whenever I look at a book like yours, or kind of going into any aspect of, whether it's the 1960s or in this case, the late, 1800s, I always get fascinated by just the media of that time, like the old advertisements, especially. Like, I just love how those things get communicated, and so
Yes.
In your chapter, you give this idea, this transcript from a newspaper, and then this is in Chicago. So in April 1894, Chicago's Inter-Ocean newspaper published a large promotion of Dowie's faith healing with headlines almost a quarter page long in an article spanning half a page. And it cracks me up too, because just the description, you have sections that are just totally right, either in caps, a bunch of caps and exclamation points. So this is the description. It says, Latter-day Miracles, in caps, afflicted divinely healed by Reverend John Alexander Dowie, wrought by faith, in caps, lame made to walk and the blind restored to sight, deaf made powerless. Victims are snatched from the brink of the grave. Testimonies of those relieved of suffering, made whole, and saved from dying. Right? And so they have examples of people that were healed. So people like May Lowen claimed to have been healed of paralysis. You also had people that were a paralysis, a sore throat, sometimes a cancer, blindness, tuberculosis. I mean, you kind of name it. It's kind of like a one-size-fits-all. But this is my, testimony of witnesses of people who have healed me. And you see that continuing going on. So what, like in this, I mean, were there people who are starting to speak out against them, or eventually, I mean, some people might get a placebo effect. Do you start getting defectors, or how? And is it because there always seem to be controversies surrounding him, from the outside, but people who are kind of emotionally getting caught up, maybe having some doubts. What did that kind of look like in this process?
I actually recently explained this to somebody in one of the support groups, because this is a big thing for a person who's indoctrinated into a faith healing sect. If they find one single person healed, their whole, it's like a sleeper cell, terrorist bomber. They have these normal lives until this one trigger point just sets off all of this programming in their head. And whenever a faith healer gets a legitimate testimony of somebody who is healed, to a person who's been indoctrinated like that, all of that programming sets off in their head. You were mentioning the problem of churches needing to understand the cult mind and help people like this. This is actually a huge problem, in that when people leave groups like this and they try to enter into a normal church, they will get to a place where they'll be sitting and hearing a normal, really grace-filled, good sermon. I've experienced this. And one single statement from one single chapter of one book in the Bible sets off this flood of triggers. And I've got this flood of emotion, and I actually can't take it. I actually get up and walk out. Mm-hmm. Whenever I do, there are churches who don't understand what's going on in the head of the cult mind. And there's some that are just authoritative anyway. They're Cultish, and they'll go after you and try to drag you back in, and they'll try to coerce you back in. And if you leave, if you're gone for a few weeks, well, where'd you go? Or we need to come visit with you. And that's the opposite of what these people need. I actually had lunch with the local pastor recently, and I was explaining this, and his response was amazing, because I didn't think any church got this. And he says, well, yeah, if you're going through that, you need to take a time out and just stay a few weeks away from church and heal. You heal, then you come back to church, and we'll help you through this. And if you need help during this time while you're away, he would be willing. So whenever people are indoctrinated in this state and somebody gets healed, it sets off the programming and they ignore everything else. What I explained to the people in the support groups, think of it in the opposite way. If I'm telling you that I have God's power to heal you, and you find that I have faked one single person, can you trust the other 9 of the 10 that I claim? All it takes is one single fake person, one single fraud. You have to question the whole thing. And I purposefully included every instance of somebody who did claim to be healed in the newspaper that I found is actually in the book, purposefully, because I want you to see the balance. These people claimed it, but here is this overwhelming number, far more than the people that claimed healing, who died, who were still sick, who left, in the same condition they were in.
Right. Yeah. Right. And I think one of the things, Andrew, I'm going to let you jump in here too, is that it's very easy, I think, John, to look at someone like the followers of these people, or people who follow Jim Jones, or any of these other cult members who think they're experiencing some sort of healing, and to say, oh, well, they are just stupid and I'm not stupid. And you almost sort of look at them in a condescending way. Even like the whole phrase drinking the Kool-Aid, in many ways it's a pejorative, but a lot of times like that, even that aspect, that phrase even strips the people, for example, in the people's temple of their humanity. And I think a lot of people truly don't understand the power of suggestion and how suggestible we really are. In fact, I remember there's a book that came out a couple years ago that I read called Suggestible You, and it was talking about this. They did a study where they took the small town it's either small town or neighborhood somewhere in California, close to where they had the wind turbines, the power generators, and they basically convinced a good portion of half the town that these newly built wind turbines actually were a hazard to your health, because they're going to push up a bunch of the different plants that create allergies and the dust. And so there's just a bunch of issues where it actually might be a hazard to your health. And so then they told the other part of these people in this town of the survey were saying that, no, this is actually a really good thing because they're very environmentally friendly. It's going to stop pollution. So there's actually a lot of health benefits to it. So they actually did a case study. They followed these people for several weeks after giving them this information. The people that they gave the negative connotations to, they started manifesting these allergy symptoms and different health, like respiratory health issues, due to the fact they were told that these were dangerous or bad for your health. But the people who said this is good for your health, they experienced, the majority of them actually showed respiratory, they did better. There's ways in which they medically improve. I don't know the exact details. That's just one small example. And I think that's just an aspect that we need to know. I mean, even neuroscience and all that still is infancy with what we know. But all of us are incredibly suggestible. Andrew, do you have any thoughts here? What are your thoughts so far?
Well, I mean, the Bible talks about it, right? Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things, desperately wicked. Who could know it? Desperately sick, really. When we go to the point to where our experiences determine truth, that's when it gets scary, and that's how we fall into traps. I mean, John was talking about it perfectly. He's saying they experience one thing, this one healing, and all of a sudden it just lights up this programming that overrides everything else. I mean, we see it with the LDS community, right? They say, pray about the Book of Mormon, and if you get a burning in the bosom, it's then true. And then what happens? The programming lights up, and now they read the Bible through the lens of programming that now supersedes the Bible, regardless of Joseph Smith's false prophecies, regardless of the things that make the Book of Mormon untrue. they're now replacing an identity with the identity of the cult leader in a sense and in a way. And that's because our hearts are desperately sick. They're in need of a savior. Just like the example you just brought, Jared, these people were manifesting symptoms of being sick. I mean, we have very powerful things inside of us, and it's this little 3-pound brain, you know, not saying that all of the times it's only your brain that's making these psychological symptoms. Sometimes it can be spiritual. We know in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 4 that there are different spirits. We're told about it, and we need to be worrisome about that. But the only way we can do that is when we're trusting in God's word, which he gives us the ability to read for ourselves, which is a beautiful thing to protect us from falling prey to any type of cult leader. We cross-check them with what? Scripture. And I find that to be very important. But it's, I mean, Jeremiah 17:9, man, it says it says it right there.
Yeah, in reading and studying these examples with Dowie, there was a solid mixture of really smart people. We're talking doctors, lawyers, who got embedded into this thing. And one of my partners, I don't know that I've mentioned this on a podcast. This may be the first. One of my partners is Dr. Stephen Hassan. That part I do talk about.
Awesome.
One of his books, if to the listeners who haven't read it, Freedom of Mind is incredible at understanding how to deprogram's a bad word now, how to help somebody learn how to escape a cult. It talks about the psychological aspects, but Hassan is really the first person who helped me understand that it's not that a certain demographic of people are susceptible to joining a cult. See, I'm an IT consultant, and when I left, I was mortified that people would think I was stupid because I was raised in this cult. And unfortunately, I've actually lost business because of this thing that I do, helping people out of a cult, because they see it and, oh my gosh, what is this thing? He's in a cult. He must not be smart.
Yeah.
Well, smart people, believe it or not, are even more susceptible. Because think of it. So I'm an IT consultant. I work with my brain all day, every day. If you were a carpenter and you swing a hammer all day, every day, your arm gets tired. Well, my brain gets tired. On Sunday, I go to church with my brain tired. I shut off all critical thought because my brain is tired. And I was in a cult. I was listening and being indoctrinated. I was indoctrinated, in my opinion, levels above what some of the other people were, because my brain was literally shut off every Sunday. I was a zombie in church because I'm smart, because I'm working with my brain. And this, it applies to not only what I came out of, but in Dowie's era, there were still people working with their minds, and the doctors, lawyers, etc., and they were joining this thing. The story that I haven't told people is Hassan. Are you guys Star Trek fans? Either of you?
I
like
love
Star Trek?
I love Star Trek. That's me.
So I'm a Trekkie, and I am a Trekkie now. TV was kind of forbidden in the cult I was in, but the Borg is fascinating, right?
Yeah.
The Borg. So do you know who created the Borg?
I do.
No, I don't remember who created the Borg. No.
So I'm about to surprise you guys.
Okay.
And I'm now permitted to say this. I knew this on the last show, but I was not permitted to say it at the time. The producers of The Next Generation, one of them, the wife was in the Jehovah's Witness cult. And the producer contacted Dr. Hassan and said, I want a villain that resembles this cult, and I want to attack it to the ground.
Whoa.
What they did to my wife's head is incredible. And this is the worst enemy known to mankind. So when you see a Borg, you're looking at, think of the structure of the Jehovah's Witness cult. The queen, the hive queen, is the central figure. You've got the chain of indoctrination flowing down. They've got to be plugged into the hive. When somebody unplugs from the hive or the cult, they become disoriented. That's what I deal with in my support groups. They keep wanting to connect back in. That's re-indoctrination. Every single aspect of the Borg is every single aspect of Jehovah's Witness cult, from being in it to escaping to reintegrating into life.
Wow. Andrew, is your mind being blown right now?
Dude, and it makes
Mind is
perfect
blown.
sense. And like, and what is it that like really ruined the Borg too? I remember in some of the episodes is when they met the One and they got the Borg to think for himself. And then when he went back into the hive mind, it like released this freedom, and it just caused this massive amount of confusion. I remember that. That makes perfect sense. I mean, wow, that's huge, dude. I never knew that. That's cool.
Well, that's just
It's cool
crazy
stuff.
too. Just kind of jumping into my nerd. It's been forever since I've watched Star Trek: The Next Generation, but I remember there's one particular episode where somebody on the crew, maybe it was Wesley, he gets turned into a Borg, or somebody on the crew gets turned into.
Picard does.
No,
Picard.
it's someone else, or at least, or maybe they capture a Borg. I can't remember, but somehow there's something where they everyone's arguing with Captain Picard that there might be some level of like humanity in this Borg that they captured, and I just remember I don't know what
that episode.
Yeah, so I remember, and again, I'm quoting the show. I'm not saying it specifically, but Patrick Stewart, who plays Jean-Luc Picard, he says when they're trying to say no, he's actually human. You have compassion on it. He says he's not a human. Damn it, it's a Borg. And so just in that aspect, it's like no, this is not. This is the Borg, but they're arguing for the person, the actual personal identity, but Captain Picard's looking at through the cult identity. And so it's almost like in that now that just popped in my head. Now that you're mentioning that, it makes sense even in that scene is talking about the duality between the actual personal identity versus the cult identity. You really blew our minds.
So I'm a diehard Trekkie. So take it forward to the Voyager series.
Yeah.
Where they find 7 of 9 and the others.
Yeah.
That was a splinter group of the cult. They had separated from the hive. They formed their own splinter group, and they were all working together as one unit, separated from the main unit. Every single aspect of every show, the Borg is the Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah. So all right. So let me ask you this. So we're talking about them utilizing healing to manipulate cult members. So this section of Dowie's life and ministry, it entails 2 other separate aspects that we see within cults. One, manipulating people for money, taking a big section of them, whether it's a mandatory tithe or in some case where you have to surrender all your possessions, to the group, but then also isolating them either in some sort of compound or community where it's very difficult to leave. And so this is a point where he's trying to establish his Zion temple. And he basically is talking to all his listeners where he's wanting to get, to raise money. And it's interesting too. And I want anyone in the audience to listen to this. Tell me, this isn't again in the late 1800s. Do you see anything familiar with modern day televangelism? Okay, because that's where I think of this. So this is on one of your pages, where this is a transcript where they're trying to pay for an initial plot of land. And it says, "Yes, brethren, I need your help. You know what the Bible says about faith without works being dead. You think that you have faith in me. Now I want you to prove that faith. This morning I gave all I had to the Lord, all except 27 paltry dollars. Just $27 are left to my credit in the bank. Think of it, my friends. I am doing the Lord's work, but $27. I had much more this morning, but the Lord called me, and I began signing checks. Some of you that are preparing a divine healing home at this specific address, it was for this home that I signed these checks. This home where the suffering are to be cured. All for you, brethren, you and the Lord. Now I want you to ask to contribute $1 each, that is, not less than $1. You can give more if you are able. This money will go towards completing the purchase of this beautiful home, which will be for all of you. I wish to speak of another thing. We need a piece of land in this vicinity to which we will erect a large canvas pavilion for the summer. It would be much better if we could own this land. I will now have that hat passed, and I want every one of you to contribute according to his wealth. Let it be a good, liberal collection." So you kind of see 2 things: the manipulation of money, but it's also that desire to start this area. So maybe unpack that for us. Tell us about what he would do in regards to the people who followed him, how much they had to contribute as far as financially. It sounds like a lot of manipulation going on. And how did this lead to starting this? It sounds like it was the commune outside of Chicago. Bring us into that.
Mhm. Yeah, so Dowie had multiple Zions. The one that exists today, the compound that became Zion City, Illinois, is, I think, the third attempt. He started outside of the World's Fair. That grew until they literally outgrew the structures, and they bought almost an entire, I think it was an entire city block right in downtown Chicago, Michigan Avenue, I think it was. He bought a massive church and hotel, et cetera, and they literally owned the whole block until they outgrew it. Well, the way he's funding this thing is he is telling people that he'll heal them. And so I grew up hearing William Branham say this over and over again. I never took a single offering in my life, folks. I never took an offering. It sounds just like the guy from Bonanza. I never collected money from people, but I've got this snake oil. If you just buy it, it'll make you feel good. I've never taken money before, but I just got this. Well, Dowie's telling this people the same thing. I'm not taking your money, folks. Everything I do is free. Everything, folks. Come step right up. And then when they step up, he passes the offering. Well, it costs money to do what I'm doing. Branham passed the offering plates at every service. And there were, one newspaper described it, there were two husky men who carried out big boxes of money from his revival meetings. This is a man who says, I never took an offering one single time, folks. Well, he learned that from Bosworth, who learned it from Dowie. Dowie had the same strategy. When you come to the healing homes, you basically, they actually had, they had a corporate structure. There was, I can't remember the guy's name, Spiker or something.
Yeah.
He was looking for people who was a good fit for the healing homes. And some of the people who later escaped and talked about the inner workings, if you had money, you were a good fit. Or if your family had money, you were a good fit. Mm-hmm. So he would bring them in, and they were paying for their stay, allegedly, not for the healing, for their stay. And in today's money, it's thousands of dollars per month. It's far more than I would pay for a hotel. And that was just the people who were staying in the healing homes. Once this grew into masses of people flooding, he had, 3 or 4 different churches running in Chicago at the same time before they moved to Zion. He also had Evansville, Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, all over the country, basically. But the big ones were in those locations. All of those were also funneling money in. And I think one of the pastors in, I think it was Minneapolis, is who quit first. He said that within just a short period of time, it was like $1 million that they had sent Dowie, which is a lot of money back then. Mm. And if you joined the compound, it was a communal gathering. So a lot of people were, I don't think they were forfeiting all of their money initially. They were just putting it into the community by giving it to Dowie and letting Dowie had to set up his own banking system. They had the Zion City Bank, and they would put the money in there. Dowie controlled it, and it was for the community.
Yeah, that's what I find interesting too. Like when he buys this 6,600 acres of land, 40 miles north of Chicago, and it turns into Zion City. He essentially owned it and just leased it to people. Yes. I think the leases were like 200, 300-year leases he would give people. But it's just interesting how that doesn't bring any red flags to people's minds. And, like biblically, owning
and they had paid for it. He was leasing to them the land that they helped pay.
Yeah,
but it's
exactly.
But you're giving a 300-year lease, and no one. It's like the Scientology giving people a billion-year contract.
Well, think about it. Like biblically, like having your own property is like a beautiful thing that God wants people to have. He delegates property to people, and he loves the fact that people have property so much. He says, "Thou shalt not steal." Yeah. Right. But this con man, he's using a counterfeit form of a biblical government, and he's not even letting anyone have any property whatsoever. Instead, he takes their money, like John just said, and he's like, "Here, now buy it back from me on these leases, these 300-year leases." That is absolutely asinine. And what I found interesting too, John, tell me if you know more about this, but I heard that he was actually in talks with the Turkish government to try to buy back Jerusalem. And he
Yes.
actually had plans to create a Zion, not necessarily like a Zion, but to rebuild Jerusalem. Was that true?
Yeah, he wanted. So Dowie was a doomsday prophet. He had an end of the world prophecy, and he believed that he was the last messenger, the Elijah messenger that was going to basically introduce Christ as he returned to earth. Well, he convinced all of his people that they needed to buy Jerusalem because that's where Christ was going to come back. So he was going to buy it, and then they were all going to migrate there eventually. And he was just taking their money. They never even try. I don't even know. Can you buy Jerusalem? I don't know that you can.
Right, I don't know.
Even back then, how do you buy it? How do you buy that?
Yeah, that's interesting. But we find the same thing, this common thread, right? Like starting with Dowie, like we have people like Jim Jones, man, with Jonestown. It's like Father Divine in the Peace Mission movement, the same thing where they just would like go off into these little areas where they would use other people's money to buy land and create a little commune. So what was life like there in Zion City, John?
Life was like any cult. When a compound is set up, they've got to try to keep you. Once you're there, you don't want them to entertain the notion of leaving. So you have to keep them tired. And Dowie was literally working them to the point that the government had to step in and say, you can't do this. He had, Dowie had purchased rights to make Nottingham lace from England, hired a bunch of lace makers to come to Zion, and he set up a lace factory. And to make Nottingham lace, it has to actually be from people from Nottingham, or you can't call it Nottingham lace. So this was a big deal. He fought for it politically, and it got held up in Congress, I think. And Dowie went and even had some political pull to overturn that, to release the Nottingham lace makers, set up the factories, and Zion exploded into, they had their own factories, schools, shopping, every aspect of life, from their economics to their means for making money, producing food, etc. Everything was self-contained. But to keep the people there and keep them from their minds escaping, he just simply overworked them until the government came in and said, look, these people can work 8 hours a day, and that's it.
Wow. There's a law that got introduced then to stop overworking people. What I find interesting too is typically when this starts happening, when these cult leaders start separating themselves fully from outside influence and making their own societies, that's when things get extremely wacky with themselves and their own theology. Was there anything going on with his theology that was changing, something that he never really taught before, that started developing in the 1900s, like in the early 1900s or anything like that?
That's about the time that his restoration theology came in. Whenever he was getting attacked from all sides, the Chicago had basically had as much of him as could be. Think of this connection. So Chicago, he died, and I think it was 2 years later that the mob took control of Chicago. The absence of Dowie, in my opinion, and based off of what I'm seeing, the absence of Dowie in his control was just like this fertile ground for the mob to come in and take control.
Wow.
Dowie controlled the politics, he could sway political votes. He had so many people in either influenced by him or in his cult that he could just rail some political opponent, and he would sway enough votes to sway it in the direction that he wanted. So he had control. Well, this doesn't go over well, right? So he's being attacked from all sides. And once he reaches the point where he realizes that not only has his opposition grown beyond the point of helping him grow, it's now becoming a threat. That's whenever he introduces this restoration theology, where the earth needs to be wiped out and we need to replenish with my people. And basically it's the foundation for what became the New Apostolic Reformation.
Wow. Okay. That's, I can see that. I can see that makes sense. Did he have any forms of teaching to where like there was certain people like Anglo-Saxons were part of the Jewish descent, like a lost tribes of Israel, or did he teach like anything about polygamy or anything like that? Or
There was, I don't know about polygamy, but one of the, so Christian identity doctrine is not self-contained. It's based on British Israelism, the notion that the um, the white-skinned English people were the true 12 tribes, the lost 12 tribes of Israel. That is one of the elements of Dowie's teaching. I don't know that it would be a fundamental element, and I don't know that it came in around that time. I think he may have had that before,
Oh, okay.
just from, you know, but it was a big part of his teaching.
Hey, what's up, everyone? We love that you are enjoying our content on a weekly basis, but this program cannot continue and wouldn't be possible without your support. So if you want to go to thecultishtshow.com, there is a donate tab. You can either support us one time or you can become a monthly partner with us. That will allow us to continue this program, allow us to continue to be salt and light to the kingdom of the cults. So please go to thecultishtshow.com/donate and you can support us one time or monthly. Also, make sure you check out our merchandise store. Go to shopcultish.com. You can see all of our great designs. A lot of you have gotten merchandise from us already. So again, you either go to shopcultish.com and check out all the awesome merch. Back to the show. I got a question too, just kind of going into, the intricacies of these communes, especially because it's integrated with these isolated compounds plus money plus healing. It's like all these things brought together. So in one part of your book, you're talking about the Divine Healing Home number 1, 2, and 3. It says each home was filled with approximately 100 people, or 100 people exact, who pay between $8 and $12. Obviously the whole conversation now in the political sphere of inflation, now it'd be $260 and $390 in today's money. These people were all sick, lame, maimed, or otherwise in need of care. How big are these houses? I'm thinking of 100 people. Are we talking a lot of space? Are we thinking like very close quarter barracks, or what are we looking at?
They were so small that, so Dowie created a big problem because in America we have separation of religion, church and state. So he is operating these things under the guise of religion, but he's claiming that they are a replacement for hospitals. The problem is, as you know, a hospital for 100 people is pretty good size. Well, he's got these little tiny buildings. They're literally bed to bed to bed, and they're not feeding them properly. They're malnourished. They're not getting good sleep because they're, right here out in the open. Whenever his initial 3 healing homes were basically condemned and he moved to the city block, he took over a hotel. And at that point, the government had stepped in and said, if you're going to operate a facility that is containing sick people, here are the dimensions, the minimum dimensions that you have to have for a room for the people. So at that point, I think the government had stepped in and had dictated what they could and could not do. But whenever he moved outside of Chicago, the Chicago government really had nothing to do with Zion City or whatever, as it was growing, whatever undeveloped land it was. It would be basically isolated to what was state law versus what was Chicago law.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, that's just an example of, you always see a package of a bag of goods, whatever you want to call it, being solicited, but all of a sudden when you get it, and all of a sudden, oh no, like what did I sign up for? Whether it's this or whether it's Scientology, you name it. And in your book, you talk about all the different deaths and different people that were having health issues. And even you had pretty much their version of the Department of Health getting involved. And in any of these instances, he was, whenever that happened, he was completely receptive, to receive correction in these areas and make adjustments or he was, I'm assuming he was defensive, very much so, right? A little sarcastic there.
It depended on the day. So when they came in, one of the, I was reading just last night, I was refreshing my memory before the show. One of the people who escaped the healing homes, there was an attorney that started going and contacting people who had left. And one of the people who escaped was talking to the attorney as they were forming the lawsuits against Dowie. And they said it was a horrific experience because they went and not only were they not getting better, but they're looking around in this little tiny building. They're not getting enough food. They're not getting quality food, especially for what they're paying. But they're looking at all of these other sick people who also aren't getting better. So mentally, they, even if it was a mind over matter healing, that doesn't work whenever you're looking at people who are just dying next to you and being snuck out in the middle of the night. And Dowie's own doctor was the one who was signing the papers to send them to the morgue. So they had like this, by night, they were sneaking people out of the building in hearses.
Who had died.
And so here are people who are in this thing, who they're watching this, because this is a tiny building. Everybody knows what's going on.
Oh my gosh.
And it's a horrific experience.
Yeah. And so in this whole process, there continues to be more lawsuits filed against him. And that began a lot of people started leaving, a mass exodus, which a lot of times will happen, in any aspect when you have this example of like lawsuits being filed, or if you think, the Watchtower, when they prophesied that the world was going to end in 1975, that came and went. They lost a large percent of membership. But that was a catalyst for a lot of people leaving as well, too.
It was a catalyst for a lot of people leaving, but also, and part of the question you asked initially, whenever the government, when it looked like Dowie was going to face criminal charges, Dowie's argument was, no, these aren't healing homes. These are vacation homes. People are coming for vacation. And the people who are in these homes and they're looking at all these people dying, heck no, this is not a vacation home. I wouldn't go here. But that was his first response to court. That argument didn't work because obviously he's been advertising healing. And so he did change his story. But, there was a lot of reasons why people left. Some of it had to do with Dowie not sticking with the things that he had indoctrinated them with. So now they've got this thing that they can't explain. Why is Dowie saying these aren't healing homes? That's what I paid for. But he's also doing other things that just aren't becoming of a minister. His attitude in court, his attitude against the newspapers. There are some people who got excited and they enjoyed his ranting, and they kind of like we see in politics today, whenever this big multitude of people form this verbal mob, everybody joins in. There are people who would join into the mob, but there's also this group of people that aren't going to join into the verbal attacks. And especially people who are somewhat grounded in Christianity think, well, what is this? This is not Christianity.
Right. No, that's a huge thing. And in fact, just jumping back to, that's got to be one of the most insanely ridiculous claims that they're coming here to be on vacation. Anybody, regardless of what time period, if you have money if you're going to go on vacation, especially during that era, like you've got some extra money to spend. Yeah. Why are you going to spend this extra money to go on vacation in a room full of a couple of 100 people who are sick, ill and maimed, and who are dying and being carried out in the middle of the night? They just say, if I get a hotel or hostel where that's happening, I might. There's going to be a couple 1-star reviews on Expedia for sure. Like, come on now.
It's a Stephen King vacation home.
Oh yeah, wow. That's definitely definitely in that category for sure. And so, Andrew, do you have a thought real quickly?
I was going to say, if he had like a modern Airbnb listing, ain't nobody going to it. That's how we know it ain't no vacation home. We see all those little beds everywhere. Oh yeah, and don't worry, people are sick and dying right next to you. Skip, you are not going to that home. But you said a lot of people were leaving. But what's hard, I think people need to understand, is that he had a massive following. Like when they moved to Zion City and he had his temple there, they could seat 8,000 people. Yeah. 8,000 people. The town itself ended up having almost around 20,000 people in it. Like this is not a small movement. And this is why it blew my mind when reading about this and doing the research, is how come I had no idea about this? Why did I not know that this was going on? Like Chicago was the second largest city in the world at that point in time. Like this was like a mecca of like American industrialization going on in Chicago, and he's only 40 miles north with 20,000 people in a town where he owns everything. Like you said, we have the lace workers that come in. He owned everything there. And I've never heard about this in my life until like 3 or 4 weeks ago. You know, it absolutely blows my mind.
Well, you've got the religious leaders who exist because of Dowie. Dowie was the prototype for a lot of what we see today. You talked about the televangelists. Well, yes, they sound like this because he was the prototype, and he's the reason why they exist. So you've got the Christian leaders who realize that this man wasn't really that good of a man, and they've whitewashed it or erased it. So he becomes less of a powerhouse than what they initially claimed him to be. Then you've got in Chicago, the Chicago mob came in, like I said, right after Dowie. So you've got all the mob history, which is far more fascinating than Dowie. So if you are a historian and you want to study Chicago and Chicago history, Dowie's just this side story. But in my opinion, he was the catalyst that created the void that the mob came in to fill, right?
Yeah.
So it's just such a complicated mess of history that's been erased and history that got demoted to some of the more fascinating.
How involved was he with like the temperance movement? Because I know you can look online and you can see big signs outside of Zion City, like talking about, there's no drinking, no tobacco, right. None of these things are allowed here. You're less than a dog, essentially, if you do these things. Because then you talk about the mob, it almost makes me think of William Branham, his father. Then we've got like the alcohol running in the back, the behind the scene things going on, to where it's like you push the temperance movement, but really you're also getting funded from smuggling alcohol. Like what was going on with that?
I don't see him really big with the temperance movement. I do see the Branham movement obviously got pretty big with that. So I grew up, you were mentioning the Bible, talking about, different ways in which you can use things to heal your body. One of the verses that I go to frequently with people in support groups is Paul said, take a little wine for your stomach. Yep. Paul is saying to use medicine. He's saying the alcohol properties in the wine kill the bacteria and your body gets better. In the message cult and all of its splinter groups, and basically everything that was produced by these anti-alcohol religious groups, a lot of them don't permit wine. Like in the message cult, you're not allowed to drink wine. It's included in the teetotalism doctrines that are there. I suffered, especially after leaving the cult, I suffered depression. And ironically, I tried just a little bit of wine after leaving, and I realized that this whole thing was, this whole doctrine is wrong. I hated the stuff, but I noticed that even just like this much of a little glass, it lowered my anxiety, and in turn, my depression lowered. I went off of medication in like 3 months just by having one glass of wine a week.
Wow.
It was amazing, right?
Yeah, it's a gift from God.
In the Branham cult, we talked about William Upshaw, who was the leader of the temperance movement, right? He's the guy, he's the reason why the prohibition movement prohibition existed, literally because of him. I don't think we talked about this on the show, but after he was out of Congress, and there was a period of time which he wasn't that famous and everybody kind of forgotten him, he started selling this alcoholic potion. He started promoting this alcoholic potion that was called a revitalizer. Basically, it was your snake oil, but it was alcoholic, and you take a little bit of it and it makes you feel good. And so these men who are in this kind of thing, I don't think that they even believe it. But Dowie, if you were to go into Zion and become part of his commune, no alcohol is allowed in this commune. Worse than that, so he was a businessman. He was a strategist. They set up train routes into Zion for the lace factories and then to like New York and some other cities. Initially, he also laid the rules that if your train is going to come into my city, there cannot be any alcohol on it and there cannot be any pork on it. And this was a huge problem if you think of train routes, right? They're not going to have a separate route just for certain certain boxcars. So
Mm.
they ended up fighting him and they allowed it, but they're not, the people who were in Zion weren't allowed to touch particular boxcars.
You said something that piques my curiosity. So no unclean meats, essentially.
Right. Right. He was anti-pork. He was, so if you think about the way that these groups exist and you think about the structure of their doctrine, they exist because they create sins that all the other Christians don't know. I know these secret sins, and if you come join my group, I'm going to tell you what they are so you can go to heaven while everybody else goes to hell. That's how these groups operate. Well, a lot of them, especially, the Christian cults, they will take a lot of the passages from the Old Testament law and they'll say that they still apply today. And they'll say, yes, we're under the new covenant of grace. The New Testament says that, but we also have X, Y, and Z from the Old Testament. And they don't know that, so they're going to hell. In the message cult, we grew up with that mentality. There were a lot of things from the Old Testament that we were taught that we had to obey these Old Testament, Old Covenant laws that aren't even in effect under the new covenant of grace and carry it forward. It also applies to the money. Think of the tithing laws. So I'll never forget when I escaped the message cult, we had the 10% tithe thing like a lot of these churches have. And I started studying just the tithing system. How did it work? I was in this thing. I paid tithe. How does it work? Well, you give the priest, a percentage of your excess, and the priest stores it up. It might be livestock, it might be grain. There wasn't really the concept of cash money back then. They had gold and silver, right? But it was more like a banking system for droughts or for days. They had the Sabbath day when nobody can work. You had the storage facility that had the grain, the livestock, etc. And on the seventh day, you could get some of this out. They also had parties. They stored up the wine for the parties, and there was actually a party tithe, right?
Yep.
So the people were getting back part of the tithing system. In these cults, they set up the tithing system, and they're very hard about 10%, but they only tell you the parts of the law where the priests get the money. They don't tell you the part where the people get it back. And they especially don't tell you the year of Jubilee, the 49th year, when the priest gives back everything except for what is required for him to live the rest of his days. It all goes back to the people. They won't tell you that in these cults. So in my opinion, I sincerely doubt that he did not eat pork. If you look at, him coming from Australia and from England, I just sincerely doubt this, but there's no way to prove it. But I can see that if I base it off of what I see by the examples that were produced by Dowie's cult, they are groups who are taking Old Covenant law out of context and using them as a manipulation tool. That's all it is a manipulation tool.
Yep. It's a form of mind control, man. I mean, even the LDS organization has it too with the word of wisdom. There's always, like you said, this new revelation. There's these new sins that you're not privy to that you need to follow in order to have some type of justification, in order to be declared righteous other than the blood of Jesus Christ. You need to follow X, Y, and Z to present those things before the Father. Oh man, it is pure wickedness.
Yeah.
What do you want to say, Jerry?
Yeah. Speaking of LDS, jumping back in here, this is something, John, when I was at the coffee shop reading your book, my mouth dropped to the floor. You think of the scene from the Mask where the mouth drops down. You're like, what? Is that you're talking about during this time frame, the late, the 1800s to the early 1900s, there's just this prominent number of cults. It's the Millerites, Seventh-day Adventists, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses. Everyone's sort of intersecting. And so sometimes in the multiverse of cults in the 1800s and early 1900s, they kind of cross paths with each other. So in chapter 17, it says that newspapers, because they're looking at the criticisms of what was going on in Zion, and now he was trying to get more involved politically in an almost very militant way, which is kind of the reason behind the title of your book. but it says newspapers compared Dowie to Brigham Young, fully
Right.
controlling thousands of men, women, and children while managing to create a financial engine capable of producing millions of dollars. That
Right.
my jaw hit the floor. Can you just unpack that? I mean, obviously you did research and found things to just make that small little statement there. Like, what do you know? Are you aware of any of the comparisons that at that time that they were making to Brigham Young? Because at that time, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, he would have been well established. I mean, in Utah at that time, and everything like that. But what were, just give us some examples of that if you could.
Yeah. So in my head, I don't have the exact year, so I may have my timeline slightly off, but I believe that was the point of time in which he was claiming to be Elijah, and he was claiming to be the Elijah the Restorer, which was basically the theology for the Restoration movement, and he was the messenger of the covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And my jaw dropped when I was reading a newspaper article about the lace factories. He had manipulated this guy. I think it was his brother-in-law or somebody related to him. I can't remember exactly who, but he had basically got this guy to fund creating the lace production factory. And then after the guy came in and he joined the cult and got under the mind control, Dowie somehow convinced him to sign it all over to him. And so there was this mysterious throat that was slit, mysterious death, right before this turned into a trial. So there's some really deep, dark questions there that I uncovered in the newspaper articles. But right after this guy reported it, some lady was found, her body was floating out of the Zion cult, her throat was slit, and this guy goes to court to sue Dowie over, I think it was $100,000 for this lace factory. My jaw dropped because the guy actually won against Dowie, even though he himself had signed the paper. And the argument, and I was just so shocked. The argument stood up in court even back then. They used the term undue influence. He was unduly influenced. In other words, he's under mind control. So at that point, not only is it public opinion that he is brainwashing and mind controlling the people, it is now a legal opinion that Dowie is manipulating and controlling the minds of the people. Not only that, he's got messengers who are going even into Canada who are proclaiming that Dowie is the restorer. He's the one who's bringing back the Christ. And if you know how somebody who's that insane to believe that, how that works, a subset of those start believing that Dowie is the return of Christ, and then all of that mess goes out. So his influence is just as vast and wide-reaching as LDS was at that time, but he also has the control, and he probably at that point had far more money than they had. I mean, he was labeled the richest man in the West.
Yeah, and even like in one of the earlier chapters, there's a point where he has a year-end drive where he reaches out to all his members and says, we need to raise $1 million by, I believe it was Christmas, which at that time would have been $1 million, which, in our day would have been $33 million. So, I mean, this guy was always trying to use every little crevice and inch to try and bring in, really as much money as he had. And maybe just very curious, because, I mean, I feel like there's so many little sub-subjects that could be a podcast within a podcast. I feel like we're almost going like Inception level with this. So real quickly, I mean, as this is escalating, he's claiming to be, Elijah, which is a common thing. I mean, William Branham, I'm sure in many ways got his ideas like very similar, claiming to be the spirit of Elijah based in Malachi for sure. But when he started getting involved, the political aspects of Chicago, I mean, like how did that kind of work out as well too? Because he's got Zion, he's got this compound where he's got all these people going on. There's leadership, there's different lawsuits going on against him. But he was also, at the same time, he was trying to get involved politically to try and at least have control over aspects of different politicians in Chicago. Like, how did that work together as far as, from a political standpoint?
From a political standpoint, these political leaders were likely just converts to the cult.
Right.
But if you think of, look at the mob. So what Dowie did was essentially what the mob came in and filled the void of. So you have to kind of compare them. The mob had people in key positions to keep the business running, to keep what's going on behind the scenes. Dowie is, I could not find anything that was specifically labeled illegal from Dowie, but the person whose throat was slit clued me into, there's probably some more things going on behind the scenes. And if you read between the lines, there definitely is. But if you put key people into politics, it keeps the business running. But even more to the point, once he starts the Restoration movement, he is starting the premise of theology that our government is evil. We need to restore to the original condition of the church, which means wipe all of this out and replace it with my own. And he starts his own political party. So by having key people in Chicago and some of these various cities, then also it establishes a baseline for him to start his own political party, which he did.
Yeah, and that's huge. In fact, when we were talking about his political associations, like later on, it says that newspapers have pointed out the similarity. I didn't know this, the title that they gave, Dowieites, and the Mormons that followed Brigham Young. You had Zion guards that stood at arms, decked out in gold lace, wearing the Zion insignia with a cross and crescent. Then days later, Dowie signed naturalization papers to become an American citizen. And you kind of have that too, where, Brigham Young had his own standing army, and you had John D. Lee, who basically was like Brigham Young's avenging angels. And so you see, similarities there. But in many ways, when you end up kind of, where does this all go? And again, you'll have to refresh my memory because it's been a couple weeks since I read the book. But really, where this goes, it ends very tragically, and it's connected to both his personal health, if I recall, but also his daughter.
Right.
But I think it was what happened with his daughter first, which ended up then affecting his health. So in many ways, what you end up seeing, and I'll let you elaborate, is that everything that he preached his entire life about being able to save people, he couldn't save himself. But yeah, bring us into that, because there's so much more. We've been going for a while here that we could literally unpack it, a couple more podcasts. But yeah, bring us into like where does this all go to? What's the catalyst towards that towards the tragic ending here?
Yeah, so there's so much that happened at the end. Literally, it could have been split out into 2 or 3 books, but I purposefully ended it there and ended it quickly, because what happened after Dowie died is almost just as fascinating as this book, which opens the door for part 2, if you will. But yeah, towards the end of his life, there was a lot of tragic things that happened and a lot of big things that happened. In my opinion, the climax of this cult was whenever he basically tried to invade New York City. And so if you look at the end of his life, the things that were his downfall, I could list the invasion of New York City, which failed miserably. His daughter had a very tragic death, and Dowie himself suffered a series of what appears to be strokes. And he there was a large period of time where he started recording his sermons, and it brought me back to days of my being in the Branham Message cult. They played tapes of Dowie while he wasn't present, just like I listen to tapes of Branham while he's dead. And, Branham obviously recorded these sermons pattern after Dowie. He's one of the few faith healers who did this. So his daughter was probably, for his health's sake, it was probably the most severe impact, and also a big reason why a lot of people left.
Yeah.
When his daughter, she was doing her hair or something, and it caught fire, And it burned her so severely that the newspaper said parts of her flesh were just dripping from her body as she ran for help. And Dowie, who's his whole ministry in the United States, has told people that doctors are evil, don't go to the hospitals, they're dens of demons, and all of these things. At first, he tries to obey his stage persona and he keeps his daughter away. But then he realizes that she is going to die if I don't get help. So he calls a physician on scene, but by the time he calls them, it's too late. She only lasted just a few more hours. So you've got all of these people who are watching this thing. They literally invested their whole lives into believing that it was wrong to call a physician, that Dowie had the healing answers, Dowie had the healing power, and his prayer of faith did not save his own daughter. What happened and why did he call a physician? He said not to do this, right? There were also, combined with that, you had a lot of the, was it smallpox? There's a lot of just in the United States, there was a big spreading of diseases that if you were in the United States, you were likely going to be impacted by this. Well, there were no exception. And they were like the cult today that I escaped. A lot of them are anti-vax. They will not take the COVID vaccine because, you know, you don't have enough faith. If you had enough faith, you don't need the COVID vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like the cult that I escaped, now when they're watching, unfortunately, some people are dying because they didn't get the vaccine. Well, Dowie's sect was watching the daughter die. They were watching people die of these diseases that could have been prevented or at least, you know, made not as bad as it was. And all of this was just, I think it was a big taxing on Dowie's mind. I don't know if it caused the stroke, but it probably severely contributed to the stroke.
Mm. What's interesting too, John, is that when you're talking about him, it seemed like he was struggling back and forth whether or not you could, whether or not he actually should get medical care. It seemed, do you think you're talking earlier about the fluctuation between the cult identity and the actual, person? As much as this guy was this crazy, faith healer conning all these people, he still was a real person, who probably had care and affection for his daughter. So even though he was his cult leader, I don't want to fully strip him of his humanity. Do you think there might have been kind of this duality or fluctuation between these two identities? No, he needed I need to get a doctor for her because in the faith healing isn't working, she's suffering. Kind of like this going back and forth. That's instinctively where I felt like I went when I kind of was reading this, now hearing you talk about it.
From my opinion, which, without having Dowie to examine, there's no way to know. But these fake personas that these people create, initially, in my opinion, they don't believe it. William Branham is the example that I use because it's the cult I escaped, but also he was literally Dowie was his prototype. In the beginning, I do not believe that Branham believed any of this stuff because he would go to one town and he would say one thing and he'd go to the very next town sometimes and say the exact opposite. He would go to one city and say anybody who believes in the Trinity has taken the doctrine of demons, and the Trinity was a Catholic idolatry made from Satan himself. And then in another town, he would say, we have accepted you, Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, come into our hearts tonight. A person who does that, especially a minister, they do not believe what they are saying, not at all. But there is the psychological effect. If you put on a stage persona for as long as these men do this, and your mind starts to decay, there is a possibility that you start to believe some of the fiction that you initially did not believe. So the hard part for me is knowing, well, did this happen to Dowie, or was his pride what got in the way? I actually I actually spent a lot of time thinking about exactly what you just described. And it's funny that you brought it up because I spent weeks. I actually paused at that part in the chapter because where do I go with this? Right. Did this man believe it? Did he not? And I just left it. I decided not to go anywhere with it. But in my opinion, I don't believe that he had gone that far. I think his pride literally stopped it. I think he was literally, I'm going to lose everything if the people see me get a doctor. I'm going to lose this entire empire that I have built. And then he forfeited it at the last minute. I believe if he had fallen into that stage persona, I think he would have stuck with it and believed it and tried to faith save her. But he didn't. He waited until he finally realized it's gone too far. I'm going to lose her, which makes me think that his pride got in the way and he thought he would lose his empire.
Mm. Wow. Andrew, what are your thoughts on that as we're kind of getting in the final stage of this talk here?
The sad irony of this life that was taken is the fact that he tasted something that he had been doing to many other families for years.
Right.
It happened to him. There's the recollection of a story of one lady who died from blood poisoning, and it could have been prevented. Mm-hmm. And the husband actually, he said that he wouldn't have called the hospital or had her picked up either, even if she wanted to, because she must have been out of her mind at that point. But what was said after is one of the ladies who worked at the healing house, Mrs. Bratz, she said that the reason why this woman died was because right before she was about to die, the husband actually had a change of mind and ended up calling someone over to come look at her. By the time they came, she died. And she said that person died because of that husband's lack of faith. Right. And so what we're seeing happening is, Jesus says it, they will be judged by their fruits, right? Fruits look tasty. Fruits taste good, right? But at the same time, over time, those fruits that are not fruits of God can damage somebody, and they do often damage people, right? Like James says it, how can a spring of living water, right, produce bitter water or salt water? Jesus Christ is the living water, and what comes from a Christian, the gospel itself is the living water which comes from Christ. But these false prophets and these teachers, they spring forth bitter water, and people drink it for a time, and maybe it's good at first, but over time it'll hurt them. And what happened was he literally succumbed to his own fruits. Yeah. And that's the sad reality of it. It didn't have to happen that way. Like, repentance is a real thing. It could have all ended, but like you said, John, his pride got in the way. His daughter died because of this. This is real life situations. These are things that happen. And then what happens? He succumbs to stress and gets strokes. His mind is failing him. Like, this is life. This is life. This is why we need Jesus, because we can't even fathom reality in these circumstances. Because right in a minute, in like literally 30 seconds, all of a sudden, he is faced with the very same dilemma that everyone that he has ever pushed in the wrong direction has faced in their life. He never had to deal with it. But then right there, within 30 seconds, her hair lights on fire. This act of God, boom, he comes face to face with his own theology. And what does he do? He succumbs.
Yeah.
He succumbs.
And even for anyone who reads the book, I'll just give away, I found the very end just fascinating. I mean, it's almost kind of like the way you ended it, John, this book, is it just ends like, wow. It just kind of hits you about some people, they just cling on to like the bitter end. It's kind of like the people, I forget the type of monkey in Africa where they have like the basket and they put the certain fruit in the basket and they catch them because they stick their hand in, but they're not willing to let go of the fruit. I'm trying to think of that, but there's this level of stubbornness. And it's almost like you see Alexander Dowie at his deathbed, and he's basically saying the millennium has set in. I'll be back in 1,000 years. Like, who says that on their deathbed?
Yeah.
Like, how insane do you have to be? But at the very end, it's like he's talking about he's forgiving everyone. And what you're seeing is just, I think that's very reflective of probably his entire life of how he manipulated people, where oh, he's forgiving them. So it's everyone's fault except his own. Everyone's wronged against me, and that's a characteristic you see in people who are manipulators and the people who are narcissists. It's always like, hey, well, I forgive you. Like, what? Oh, I just want, they'll come up to you and they say, oh, I just want to let you know that I forgive you. I'm like, for what are you talking about? Oh, when you did this, this, and this. So they actually use forgiveness as a way to manipulate and hold that against you. And like, you see him talking about whoever this person, he said, there's a woman, she's been against me for 8 years, but I forgive her too. Like, you manipulating people in this way on your deathbed just shows you just the tragedy of where this ends up. And it just reminds me of that scripture in Psalms where it says the sorrows of those who go after other gods will multiply, after false gods. And you see at the end of his life, what did he entail? It's just this collateral damage of who knows how many souls and who knows how many people were manipulated and hurt and destroyed by this horrific ideology. And when you see this, it's a fascinating conversation, but again, it brings to the forefront bad theology hurts people and theology matters.
Yeah.
And there's nothing new under the sun. You look at, today, I'm thinking when we were talking about some of his, gathering funds and stuff like that, I thought at the very beginning of the American Gospel film where it shows a clip of Kenneth Copeland where he's yelling, money, there's, so you see that like happen all the time, like every aspect from cults to people, on TBN who are manipulating the sick and the old, to, every single aspect of this. There's nothing new under the sun. And so it's important to know your Bible, read your Bible, understand like what does God say about you, knowing that you have a standard by which to test people by. If you have a pastor, don't take his word for it. Test everything by Scripture. And that's why having a Christian worldview, being grounded in the faith is so important. So John, I appreciate you coming on here. Do you have any last thoughts on this whole discussion? If you could maybe sum up anything, what would be your last thoughts here?
Well, I'm sitting here amazed. I'm really glad that you talked about the ending. You're actually the first feedback on the ending, and I ended it specifically like that, hoping that people would get exactly what you just said, because what happens next is also just as fascinating. Like I said earlier, there's so much that happens after Dowie dies, and writers take a tendency, at least from what I've read, to go into that, and you lose the fact that Dowie has just lost his empire, his entire world crumbled, and he had a taste of his own medicine. So I tried to end it like that and hopefully leave room for the next book. But my experience, my life experience coming out of this thing is that it is so vastly wrong. The way that these men manipulate people for money, and they give no thought whatsoever to the people who are being impacted by this. To Dowie's daughter, he lost his daughter over this, but look at the hundreds of people who are in a similar religion in this era. I mean, back then, yes, there were people that they were easily duped because they weren't as educated. Educated is not the word. They weren't as aware that there were corrupt people out there. Well, we have it today, but we also have this large number of people in cults today who are being manipulated, and there are also people dying. I mentioned earlier, as either this podcast or the previous, about having some people over from my support group, and they were talking about people who were in this kind of thing, and there were a large number of them who committed suicide. And it's just horrific. I cannot believe that a minister who is supposed to be the shepherd, who's leading the sheep, who's saying things that are watching his sheep die. And he has to know, right? He has to know that people are dying from this, but doesn't care at all because the money's still coming in.
Wow. Well, thank you, John. This has been such a great summary, and I feel like there's so much that we unpacked here, and there's so much more that we could go into, but we do have to wrap up here. Just real quickly, one last time, where can people find you at? And tell them one last time about your book.
My website is william-branham.org. And if you like this podcast, we're going to be launching a new podcast in July where we talk about a lot of the history some of the history we're talking about now, but as it relates to modern history. So we'll be going over that. The book is Militant Christian Extremism, a critical examination of John Alexander Dowie. You can find it on Amazon. You can also find it on my website in the book section. You'll find a link to the Amazon. And we hope soon to have it on audiobook, so it'll be on Audible.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, thank you guys all for listening and going extra innings with us. And as always, a program like this cannot continue without your support. So if you want to support Cultish and allow content like this to come out on a regular basis, go to thecultishshow.com. You can go to the donate tab. You can donate one time or monthly. So all that being said, we will talk to you guys next time on Cultish, where we enter into the kingdom of the cults. Talk to you guys next week.